She was 22 years old. She had bad teeth, a government ID card, and a job that paid almost nothing. Every morning she sat down at a long wooden table in a converted schoolhouse in the East Prussian forest, surrounded by other young women just like her, and she ate. That was it. That was the whole job. She ate whatever was placed in front of her. She chewed, she swallowed, she waited. If she was still alive, 45 minutes later, the food was declared safe for Adolf Hitler. Her name was Margot Wilk, and for 70 years she told nobody. Not her neighbors in West Berlin. Not the journalists who walked past her apartment building every single day. Not the documentary crews who spent decades interviewing every living witness to the Third Reich they could find. She said nothing. She smiled and nodded, and let the world write its history without her. And the world was grateful for the convenience. The women who sat beside Margot at that table, the other food tasters, the ones who shared her bread and her dread and her silence, most of them did not make it out of the war the way Margot did. They were shot by their own side. In the final days of the Reich, as Soviet forces closed in on East Prussia, SS units executed several of the food tasters rather than allow them to flee west, rather than allow them to talk. Margot survived only because a German army officer, acting alone and without orders, put her on a transport and drove her away from the village of Grossparch before the executions began. Think about that sequence of events. An entire group of women systematically silenced. One survivor. One officer whose name is barely remembered. And 70 years of nothing. That is not a coincidence. That is a structure. That is what it looks like when an institution decides that certain knowledge must not travel forward through time. And the question that should keep you watching this entire video, the question Margot herself could never fully answer, is this. What exactly did she know that was so dangerous it cost her colleagues their lives? The tendency when we hear the words Hitler's food taster is to imagine someone extraordinary, a spy, an ideologue, a true believer who chose proximity to evil. The truth is almost unbearably ordinary, and that ordinariness is precisely what makes her testimony so difficult to dismiss. So let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to a young woman in Berlin who simply ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time, and who spent the rest of her very long life. She lived to be 96, trying to figure out what to do with what she had seen and eaten, and survived. Margot Wilk was born in Berlin in 1917, 2 years into the first great catastrophe of the 20th century and 2 decades before the second one would swallow her whole. Her early life was the life of millions of ordinary Germans in the Weimar years, constrained, uncertain, shaped by inflation and unemployment, and the low hum of political instability that never quite went away. She was not a member of the Nazi Party. She had no special access to the machinery of the Reich through family connections or professional ambition. What she had was a husband and an apartment, and then the war took the husband. He was conscripted, sent east, and for long stretches of time she simply did not know whether he was alive or dead. Margot Wilk in 1941, 1942, 1943 was not a woman in a position to make bold choices. She was a woman trying to survive in a city that was slowly being bombed into rubble, with no income and no way to predict what the next week would bring. In 1942, Berlin's civil authorities began evacuating civilians from the capital. Women without war-essential employment were relocated to rural areas in Germany's eastern territories. Margot was among those evacuated. She was sent east to East Prussia to the village of Grossparch. Dense forest, flat land, the particular quiet of a landscape that has been farmed for so many generations, it has forgotten how to be anything else. She did not choose Grossparch. She did not know, when she arrived, what was located a few kilometers away in the same forest. The Wolfschanz, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's main military headquarters on the Eastern Front, was right there, in the trees, behind the wire. And then came the knock on the door. And after that, nothing was ever ordinary again. What the official account does not capture is what it actually felt like to be collected by SS men and driven to a building in the woods and told what your new job was. She said she was taken to the Gästehaus, a kind of guest and support facility near the Wolfschanz. She was brought into a room with other women. There were approximately 15 of them in the rotation at various points. Food was brought. The food, Margot remembered distinctly, was always plentiful by wartime standards. Vegetables, a grain of some kind, occasionally meat. Hitler was a known vegetarian, and the meals reflected that. After the meal, the women waited. The 45 minutes or so of just sitting and monitoring your own body for signals of wrongness, a tightening in the throat, a cramp below the ribs, a dizziness that shouldn't be there. She mentioned asparagus specifically. Asparagus was a dish that appeared regularly, that Hitler apparently favored, and that Margot remembered because its taste is distinct. Because eating asparagus in a room full of silent, frightened women while SS guards watched was an experience her memory apparently encoded at maximum resolution. She did not fall ill. Not once, across what she estimated was 2.5 years of this duty, did the food make her or the other women sick. And that fact, the absence of incident, is its own strange burden, because it means the dread never got to resolve itself into an event. It just accumulated. Some had clearly decided to simply not think about it, to perform the act of eating as mechanically as possible and store the fear somewhere, inaccessible. Others were visibly struggling. One woman used to shake before every meal, just her hands, just enough that you'd notice if you were sitting nearby. She also noticed that the administrative structure around the food tasting was surprisingly opaque, even to the people inside it. The women were not told who cooked the food, where the ingredients came from, or what they were specifically being tested for. A German army medic named Krüger, attached to the Wolfschanz support staff, told a relative decades after the war that the food tasting procedure was administered under protocols that even he, a medical professional on site, was not fully cleared to review. His relative quoted him as saying the whole thing was designed so that no single person understood more than their own small piece of it. That is not a system built for efficiency. That is a system built to ensure that no one person could, later, tell a complete story. In 2012, a German journalist, Tobias Kempf, found Margot. She was 95 years old. She was living in Berlin. She had survived the war, survived the Soviet advance, survived the long decades of the Federal Republic, survived the reunification. She had survived everything. And Kempf convinced her to speak. What she said in those interviews, which were reported by the Associated Press in 2013, and subsequently covered by major outlets around the world, carried the weight of 7 decades of compression. She described the meals, the guards, the waiting, the women beside her. She described the asparagus. She described the afternoon she was pulled out of Gross Parch by the officer who saved her life. And she described the thing she had never said out loud to anyone, that she had lived all of the decades since the war knowing that the women who had not been pulled out in time had been shot, that she had been saved and they had not, that she had eaten Besatzungsgrenzen for years and then had simply not been there when they died. The guilt of that. The administrative files of the Wolfschanz food service and support operations were partially destroyed by SS units during the German withdrawal from East Prussia in late 1944 and early 1945. The specific records relating to the food tasters, the personnel files, the service records, the administrative logs, are absent from the archives in ways that go beyond what simple wartime destruction fully explains. German federal archivists who have worked with the surviving Wolfschanz documentation have noted publicly that the gaps are unusually targeted. It is not as though entire sections of the archive are missing. The food tasting program documentation specifically is not. Margot Wolk is the only documented survivor of this program who spoke publicly. That is the entire universe of direct testimony on the subject. One woman, 95 years old in 2013. Every other potential witness had been silenced. By execution, by time, or by a fear so well-founded that it outlasted the regime that created it by 7 decades. Margot specifically told her interviewer that she believed she was the last surviving person with direct first-hand knowledge of the food tasting operation as it was actually conducted, not as a bureaucratic abstraction, as a lived experience. She also mentioned that at least one other food taster had survived into the post-war period, but had refused all contact with journalists, researchers, or historians who attempted to reach her. What does it mean when someone's fear of speaking outlasts the regime that created that fear by 40 or 50 years? What exactly were they afraid of? David G. Marwell, a historian who has worked extensively with Nazi-era documentation, noted that the logistical details Margot described were consistent with what was known about the Wolfschanze's support operations from other sources. German historian Henrik Eberle, who had published extensively on Hitler's personal life and the institutional apparatus that surrounded him, had established that the program existed and that it involved civilian women from the surrounding area. What Margot's testimony added was the interior dimension. What it felt like, what it looked like from inside the room, what the texture of ordinary terror was when it was stretched across years rather than concentrated into a single dramatic event. The German documentary tradition, the oral history initiatives collecting testimony from surviving witnesses to the Nazi period, did not, in its main collections, include testimony from a food taster. Not because the interviewers did not know the program existed, but because no food taster would speak to them. There is one artifact that survived. Not a document, not a photograph, something far more ordinary and therefore somehow more solid. Margot Welk kept, for the rest of her life after the war, an extremely strong aversion to asparagus. She could not eat it. The taste triggered something she described as a physical revulsion that had nothing to do with conscious choice. Her body had encoded the association between that specific food and those specific years and that specific sick room so completely that the response was automatic, beyond the reach of rational override. Margot's asparagus aversion is a physiological artifact of events that the institutional record has been largely stripped of. It is proof that is written in nerve pathways rather than on paper, and it is proof that survived every effort to eliminate the traces of what happened in that room. Margot Welk died on March 29, 2014. She had been born in the year that the First World War began. She died in the year that the First World War's 100th anniversary was being commemorated across Europe. The asparagus she could not eat is, in its own strange way, the most honest record we have of what the food tasting program actually was. Not an abstraction, not an administrative protocol, something that happened to a real woman's body in a real room in a real forest in East Prussia. You have just spent this time with the only first-hand testimony that exists from inside the Wolf's Lair food tasting program. One woman, one survivor out of what should have been 15 or more. Everything else, the other women, the administrative records, the documentation that would have told us exactly how many people participated, all of it is gone. Destroyed, suppressed, lost, or locked inside the minds of people who decided that speaking was not safe. Margot Welk broke that silence, not because she had suddenly decided the information was safe. She broke it because she was 95 years old, and the weight of 70 years of knowing something that no official record acknowledged had become heavier than the fear of the consequences. She spoke because the women who were shot in Gross Parch in the final days of the war had never had anyone to speak for them, and she was the last person alive who could. The unanswered question, the one that her testimony opens rather than closes, is what exactly the regime feared from these women. The food tasting itself was not a secret. So what was it that warranted execution rather than evacuation? What did these women know through proximity and observation and 2.5 years of sitting in that room that was dangerous enough to require their permanent silence? Margot did not answer that question. She may not have known the answer. Or she may have known it and decided even in 2013 that it was still the one piece she would not give away. What was she protecting? What was she still holding back, even at 95, even with nothing left to lose? We do not know. What do you do with a history that is deliberately incomplete? What is your obligation when you encounter a story that was structured from the inside to prevent itself from being known? The women who sat beside Margot at that table, who chewed the same food, waited through the same 45 minutes, shared the same specific texture of institutional dread, have no names in the official record. They have no files, no testimonies, no monuments. They have Margot's memory of them, and now they have yours. The question of what they knew, of what was so dangerous about their knowledge that it had to be destroyed along with them, remains open. The archive is silent. The asparagus is still sitting on Margot's table, untouched. And somewheres in the gap between what was documented and what was lived, the truth of what happened in that room in the East Prussian forest is still waiting to be fully recovered. Whether it ever will be depends entirely on how many people decide, as Margot eventually decided. That silence is no longer the right answer.